Kit sat on the cot with him and gave him a slap to hurry him out of his stupor. "Wake up, Buttercup." His eyes fluttered open, blue and startled. He tried to jerk upright, but the rope restricted him. "What are you doing?" He looked around, disoriented. "What is this place?" "You mean you don't know about Daddy?" said Kit, surprised. "About the room where he did everything? You're in it. Don't you feel special? You should, so take your shoes off and set a spell." Kit laughed. "You're gonna be here a while." The Prowler looked like he wanted to laugh too, like he wanted to believe it was all a big joke. But then Kit flicked her gold switchblade, and the laughter curdled. "This is a mistake." "You got that right," said Kit, smiling at him. "You picked the wrong house." "I just wanted some things, just bonesaw killer things. I wasn't gonna hurt y'all, I swear." "A few things for what?" asked Kit. The Prowler hesitated, shamed. "To sell online." "Craigslist or eBay?" "It didn't matter." "Don't matter to me, either," said Kit, as if revealing a secret. "I figured I could make extra money for school, just—" Kit touched the switchblade to the Prowler's mouth, silencing him. His mouth trembled beneath the press of the blade. "School's out, Buttercup." Fancy moved closer to the cot. "Kit, listen." "What do you think?" Kit asked as she tapped the blade against the Prowler's mouth. "Throat? Heart? His eyes would be the obvious choice, but I want to look into him while he dies." "Why? Think you'll see Daddy stamped in his corneas, giving you a thumbs up?" Fancy regretted her sharp words when Kit looked at her with tears shivering in her eyes. "Sounds good to me." And like that, Kit handed Fancy the nuke she'd been looking for. "If you want to see Daddy, I'll show you." For a long moment, Kit simply stared at her sister, unable to speak, and when she did, her voice was unusually soft. "You said you couldn't see him anymore." "I ain't even tried," Fancy admitted. "Not for a long time. But I will if you promise not to kill him." "You do that?" "I'll try." Kit swung off the cot, her eyes shining as before, but not with tears, with excitement. "Try now!" Fancy scanned the metal shelves, but knew it was hopeless. "There ain't anything in here to look through." "The kinetoscope?" Kit pushed Fancy in front of the small cherrywood box with a round lens on the front that sat atop a brass stand. It was what had passed for television about 100 years ago. People would turn the crank and watch images unfurl through the lens. Daddy had fixed the kinetoscope, but hadn't been able to find the right kind of film or the crank that would make it work. But even though the machine was empty and crankless, it was still possible to see moving images inside of it. It was for Fancy. She had farsight, that's what Daddy called it, an ability to see what was happening in the next room or miles away. All she needed was something reflective to look at, and she could see anything. She could even make up things. Like the happy place, a world she'd invented after Daddy had gone away, a world she needed. The real world had stopped being fun a long time ago. "I only ever see the happy place in the kinetoscope," Fancy protested, already sorry she'd offered. It hurt too much to think about Daddy. "I've never seen anything real in this thing." "You said you'd try." So Fancy tried. She only had to think of what she wanted to see, real or imaginary, and she would see it. So she knew right away, when the lens of the kinetoscope remained black, that it wasn't working. But she furrowed her brow and clenched her fists so that Kit would feel she'd at least... A scream sent her whirling in time to see Kit's gold switchblade slice across the Prowler's chest. A second slice crossed the first cut, forming a large red X. "Kit!" "Don't mind me," she said cheerily. "Just keeping myself entertained." "You promised you wouldn't kill him." "He looked dead to you?" Kit pointed the dripping blade at the writhing, wild-eyed Prowler. "'Cause he looks real spry to me. I'm just gonna play with him until you bring Daddy up on the screen." She drew back her switchblade, and Fancy quickly turned her gaze back to the kinetoscope. The happy place bloomed bright and large in the round lens, a mostly sepia-toned panorama straight out of Better Homes and Gardens. It did that sometimes without her having to think about it consciously. The headless garden was in view on the screen, the area in the happy place she most liked to watch, because it had the most calming effect on her. Fancy knew the place well, down to the sundial and the fountains, the animal topiaries and the carefully sculpted hedges. At the very center of the garden stood a circle of headless, winsomely proportioned statues that gave the garden its name. Fancy loved looking at the statues, mostly because she could look at them as long as she wanted, and they couldn't look at her with disgust in their eyes, or ask snide questions about Daddy and whether it was true that he ate all his victims. But watching the statues wasn't calming her, because they were bleeding. Slashes appeared randomly on their golden skin, as though from invisible whips, their blood a golden glitter that dusted the air like pollen, vibrant against the sepia landscape. The golden blood beckoned Fancy to run and play in it, to catch it on her tongue like snow. Fancy! Fancy jerked away from the screen, blinking, trying not to notice the whimpering mess on the cot and failing. What? I asked you if you want to turn. Kit noticed the beige glow of the screen and rushed to the kinetoscope, beaming. I told you to tell me when Daddy... The hope in her face faded at the sight of the oddly bleeding statues. Try again. But as soon as Fancy thought about Daddy, the screen went black. Damn it! Kit kicked the bowed brass legs of the stand, nearly knocking the kinetoscope to the floor. She visibly reined herself in at Fancy's disapproving look and took a deep breath. Tell you what, why don't you take this? She held out the gory switchblade. And put a few hash marks on Buttercup over there. That'll help clear your mind. Fancy looked at the Prowler, shirtless now, and covered in myriad bleeding cuts. Some of them looked deep, possibly as deep as the one in his side. His blood wasn't golden like the statues, yet still it glittered and beckoned in a similar way. She turned away from the knife and wiped her sweaty hands on the short legs of her romper. You'll have to stitch all those cuts, she said, and her voice only shook a little. Says you. He's gonna bleed to death otherwise. So? Death by 1,000 cuts. Kit looked at the blank kinetoscope screen, defeated. You think Daddy ever killed anybody that way? You promised. Kit snatched the first aid kit from the shelf and tossed it to Fancy, who almost fumbled it in surprise. You stitch him up. Fancy opened the kit and noted the sutures and hooked needles, trying not to be excited at the thought of poking holes into the Prowler's skin. She kicked away the bloody rags of his shirt and knelt by the cot, but Kit followed her down. First things first. She put the switchblade in Fancy's hand and wrapped her own around it, insistent. Not until you take a turn. It's only fair. We do everything together. Fancy's hands began to sweat again. The Prowler spread out before her like an oddly iced pastry, begging to be sliced. I don't want to. Kit guided her sister's hand. The knife slid teasingly down the underside of the Prowler's bare arm as he strained against the rope. He flinched from the touch of the blade so near his armpit, as though he were ticklish, even in his fright. We're practically the same person, Kit said, like a cartoon devil whispering enticements into Fancy's ear. You think I don't know what you want? Fancy quickly nicked the Prowler's underarm, and just as quickly elbowed Kit away. There, I did it. I'm done. She freed her hand from the knife, from Kit, from temptation. Now go get me some peroxide. I don't see any on the shelf. Kit refused to be shooed. She stood and set her hands on her hips. What did I tell you about ordering me? I'm not ordering. I'm asking. Now go on. Kit blinked at Fancy's tone, one she almost never heard. Fine, spoil sport. As soon as the cellar doors closed behind Kit, the Prowler went to work on Fancy. Please, he said, his voice ruined by tears and blood loss. While she's gone, please let me go. I won't say anything. Fancy kept silent, carefully threading one of the needles from the kit. I know you're a good person. You didn't let her kill me. I know you're good. Please? Fancy looked him in his eyes until he stopped babbling and really focused on her, really saw her. When he was quiet, she said, Daddy's locked up, so we never see him. Mata had to start working 12-hour shifts to support us, so we never see her either. If Kit kills you, they'll lock her up too, and then I won't have anybody. That's the only reason you're alive. Because if I thought I could do it and not get busted, I'd kill you myself. Fancy looked away from the Prowler's horrified stare and finished threading the needle. I'm the Bonesaw Killer's daughter, she whispered, almost to herself. Why would you ever think I was good? From Fancy's Dream Diary. A doctor examined me and Kit and said the reason we were sick was because Kit had my heart and I had hers. But when he switched our hearts, they stopped beating.